In the winter of 1943, the British Admiralty believed it had won the war beneath the Atlantic. The wolf packs that had terrorized Allied shipping for 4 years were broken, driven from the convoy routes by a combination of radar, long-range aircraft, and improved tactics. U-boat losses had reached catastrophic levels, 43 submarines sunk in May alone, and Admiral Dönitz had withdrawn his forces from the North Atlantic in what amounted to an admission of defeat. The instrument of this victory was a technology that the British had been perfecting since the 1920s. ASDIC, the underwater detection system that allowed escort vessels to find and track submerged submarines with unprecedented accuracy. For a few months, it seemed that the submarine threat had been permanently defeated. Then Germany deployed a device so simple it seemed almost primitive, and the invisible war beneath the waves entered a new and dangerous phase. The technology that the British called ASDIC, the Americans would name it Sonar, worked by emitting pulses of sound into the water and listening for echoes that bounced back from submerged objects. The principle was straightforward, borrowed from the natural world where bats and dolphins use similar techniques to navigate and hunt. A submarine lurking beneath the surface would reflect these sound pulses, revealing its presence to operators trained to interpret the distinctive ping of a returning echo. By measuring the time delay and direction of the echo, escorts could determine the submarine's bearing and approximate distance. Multiple bearings from different positions could fix its location precisely enough to drop depth charges with lethal accuracy. The development of ASDIC had begun during the First World War, when German U-boats first demonstrated the submarine's potential as a weapon of mass destruction. The initial systems were crude, limited in range, and difficult to operate. Between the wars, British scientists and engineers refined the technology steadily, improving its sensitivity, reliability, and ease of use. By 1939, Royal Navy escort vessels were equipped with ASDIC sets that could detect a submarine at ranges up to 1,500 yards under favorable conditions. It was not a perfect system. Water conditions, operator skill, and the submarine's own evasive maneuvers all affected performance. But it was far better than anything that had existed in 1918. The early years of the Second World War tested ASDIC's limitations as severely as its capabilities. The system worked only against submerged targets, providing no warning when U-boats attacked on the surface at night. It lost contact at close range, precisely when depth charges needed to be dropped. It was affected by thermal layers in the water that could bend sound waves and create blind zones. Skilled U-boat commanders learned to exploit these weaknesses, diving through thermal layers to escape detection, timing their dives to break contact just before depth charges arrived. The technology was essential, but not sufficient. Victory in the Atlantic required combining ASDIC with other systems, radar, air coverage, intelligence, that addressed its shortcomings. The crisis of May 1943 represented the culmination of this combined approach. Centimetric radar allowed aircraft and surface vessels to detect surfaced U-boats at ranges that gave them no time to escape. Very long-range aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic gap where submarines had previously operated with impunity. Ultra-intelligence directed escorts to convoy routes where U-boats were concentrating, and ASDIC provided the final element, allowing escorts to track and destroy submarines once they submerged. The system was not flawless, but it was effective enough to inflict losses that Germany could not sustain. Dönitz understood the nature of his defeat better than most. The U-boat force had not been outfought in the traditional sense. It had been rendered tactically obsolete by technologies it could not counter. The submarines of 1943 were essentially the same designs that had begun the war in 1939, optimized for surface operations with the ability to submerge when threatened. They spent most of their patrol time on the surface, where their diesel engines could propel them at speeds that allowed them to overtake convoys and position for attack. Submersion was a defensive measure, a way to escape detection and attack, not a mode of sustained operations. The combination of radar and aircraft had made surface operations suicidal. Without the ability to operate on the surface, the U-boats could not function. The solution that German engineers developed was not a new invention, but an adaptation of an existing technology. The Schnorkel, the name came from the German word for snore, describing the sound the device made, was a retractable tube that allowed a submarine to run its diesel engines while remaining at periscope depth. Air was drawn in through the tube, exhaust was vented through a separate channel. The submarine could recharge its batteries, refresh its atmosphere, and maintain propulsion without exposing more than a few feet of pipe above the surface. Radar, which needed a substantial target to produce a reliable return, would struggle to detect such a minimal signature. The concept was not German in origin. Dutch submarines had experimented with similar devices before the war, and the German Navy had captured several Dutch boats equipped with schnorkels when the Netherlands fell in 1940. The technology had been studied and set aside, considered unnecessary, when U-boats could operate freely on the surface. The disasters of 1943 changed that calculation entirely. Suddenly, any device that allowed submarines to avoid surfacing became not a convenience, but a survival necessity. The engineering challenges of making the Schnorkel operational were substantial. The tube had to be strong enough to withstand the pressure of waves breaking over it, yet light enough to be raised and lowered quickly. It needed valves that would close automatically if the head dipped below the surface, preventing water from flooding the engine room. The exhaust system had to prevent back pressure that could damage the diesels, while also concealing the visible signature of engine smoke. The entire apparatus had to be integrated with submarines that had not been designed to accommodate it, requiring modifications to boats that were already in service and changes to production lines for boats under construction. The first Schnorkel-equipped U-boats entered service in early 1944, and their impact was immediate and troubling to Allied commanders. Submarines that had previously been detected and attacked on the surface were now invisible to radar for extended periods. Aircraft that had dominated the Bay of Biscay, the transit route between German bases and the Atlantic hunting grounds, found themselves patrolling empty seas. The kill rate against U-boats, which had reached decisive levels in 1943, began to decline. The Germans were adapting, and the adaptation was working. For the crews of Schnorkel-equipped submarines, the experience was a mixture of relief and misery. Relief because they were no longer being bombed every time they surfaced to charge batteries. Misery because Schnorkel operations were physically brutal in ways that surface running had never been. The submarine's interior became a closed environment for days at a time, with no fresh air except what the diesels left behind. Carbon dioxide levels rose as the crew exhaled. Oxygen levels fell as the diesels consumed it. Men developed headaches, nausea, and the slow cognitive impairment that comes from breathing degraded atmosphere. The diesels themselves, running in a confined space with minimal ventilation, filled compartments with fumes that added carbon monoxide to the toxic mix. The head valve problem was particularly vicious. When the Schnorkel head dipped below the surface, whether from waves, submarine motion, or operator error, the valve closed automatically to prevent flooding. But the diesels continued to run for a few seconds, consuming the air inside the submarine with terrifying speed. Crew members experienced the sensation of their eardrums being sucked inward as the pressure dropped. Some suffered ruptured blood vessels. Others experienced blackouts. The diesel would eventually stall, the pressure would equalize, and operations would resume. But the experience left psychological scars that accumulated over patrols lasting weeks. Navigation under Schnorkel was another challenge. The submarine could not use its periscope continuously while schnorkeling, as the wake from two tubes rather than one would be more detectable. Dead reckoning, estimating position based on course, speed, and time, was the primary method, but currents, navigation errors, and the inherent imprecision of the technique meant that submarines often had only approximate knowledge of their location. Attacks required rising to periscope depth to identify and track targets, exposing the boat to the radar detection that the Schnorkel was designed to avoid. The tactical flexibility that had made the Wolfpacks effective was severely constrained. Despite these limitations, the Schnorkel represented a genuine threat to Allied control of the Atlantic. The mathematics of detection had shifted in Germany's favor. A surfaced U-boat presented a radar target several meters high and dozens of meters long. A Schnorkel head was perhaps a meter across and extended less than 2 meters above the surface. The radar cross-section was reduced by orders of magnitude, and detection ranges dropped correspondingly. Aircraft that had been able to spot surface submarines from miles away now had to be almost directly overhead to detect a schnorkeling boat. The margin of safety that had protected convoys in late 1943 was eroding. The British response to the Schnorkel threat was characteristically methodical. Scientists at the Admiralty research establishments began studying ways to detect the devices, focusing on signatures that the Schnorkel could not conceal. The exhaust plume from the diesels, while less visible than a surfaced submarine's smoke, still contained particulates that might be detectable by specialized equipment. The wake created by the Schnorkel head, though small, might produce distinctive patterns that radar could learn to recognize. Most promising was the thermal signature of the exhaust, warm gases rising from a cold sea that might be visible to infrared sensors mounted on aircraft. ASDIC remained the primary weapon against submerged submarines, but the Schnorkel changed the context in which it operated. Previously, escorts could force a submarine to exhaust its batteries by keeping it submerged. Eventually, the U-boat would have to surface or suffocate, presenting a target for radar and gunfire. The Schnorkel broke this logic. A submarine could remain at periscope depth indefinitely, recharging batteries while moving slowly toward or away from a convoy. The escorts could detect it with ASDIC, but they could not force it to surface. The only option was to attack it underwater, a proposition that remained difficult and uncertain. The technological cat-and-mouse game that developed in 1944 was more subtle than the earlier phases of the Battle of the Atlantic. Both sides were working with systems that had significant limitations. The Schnorkel allowed submarines to avoid detection, but constrained their operational effectiveness. Allied sensors could still detect schnorkeling boats under some conditions, but could not guarantee detection under all conditions. The battle became one of probabilities and margins. A submarine that reduced its detection profile by 90% was not invisible, But it was much harder to find, and harder to find meant more likely to survive, more likely to complete its patrol, more likely to attack a convoy. The introduction of the Schnorkel coincided with other German innovations that threatened to restore the U-boat's offensive capability. The acoustic homing torpedo, designated T5 Zaunkönig by the Germans and known to the Allies as GNAT, could detect and track the propeller noise of escort vessels. Fired from a schnorkeling submarine that had approached undetected, these weapons could destroy the very ships tasked with protecting convoys. The threat was serious enough that the Allies developed countermeasures, towed noisemakers called foxes, that attracted the acoustic torpedoes away from the escorts. But the countermeasures were imperfect, and the threat remained. More worrying still were the new submarine designs that German shipyards were beginning to produce. The Type 21 was a revolutionary boat, designed from the outset for underwater operations rather than adapted from surface-optimized predecessors. Its streamlined hull reduced underwater drag dramatically. Its battery capacity was 3 times that of earlier types. Its electric motors could propel it at underwater speeds that matched or exceeded what earlier submarines could achieve on the surface. With a Schnorkel fitted, the Type 21 could transit to patrol areas submerged, operate submerged, attack submerged, and return submerged, never exposing itself to the detection systems that had defeated the earlier U-boat campaigns. The Type 21 was not available in significant numbers until the final months of the war, but Allied intelligence was aware of its development and deeply concerned about its implications. If Germany could produce these boats in quantity and train crews to operate them effectively, the Battle of the Atlantic might have to be fought all over again. The assumptions that had guided Allied strategy since 1943, that submarines could be detected, tracked, and destroyed with acceptable efficiency, would no longer apply. The Type 21 represented a genuine quantum leap in submarine capability, a boat that was as superior to the Type 7 as the Type 7 had been to First World War submarines. The Schnorkel was the enabling technology that made the Type 21 concept viable. Without the ability to run diesels while submerged, even the most advanced submarine would eventually have to surface, exposing itself to the radar and aircraft that had proven so deadly. With the Schnorkel, the Type 21 could operate as a true submarine, a vessel that belonged under the water rather than one that merely visited the depths when circumstances required. The combination of advanced hull design, extended battery capacity, and Schnorkel capability created something genuinely new. A submarine that could outrun surface escorts while submerged, that could remain underwater for days at a time without degradation of combat capability, that could approach convoys with near impunity and attack with weapons that the escort struggled to counter. The Allied response to these developments was shaped by a combination of technological effort and strategic reality. The war was clearly entering its final phase by late 1944, with Allied armies advancing through France and Soviet forces pushing westward through Poland. The submarine threat, while serious, was unlikely to reverse the war's outcome even if German innovations proved successful. The goal was to contain the U-boat campaign, to prevent it from inflicting unacceptable losses during the war's remaining months, rather than to achieve the decisive victory that had seemed possible in 1943. This defensive posture shaped tactical decisions. Convoy escorts were reinforced and improved, with newer vessels carrying more sophisticated sensors and weapons. Aircraft patrols were intensified, particularly in areas where schnorkeling submarines were known to operate. Intelligence efforts focused on tracking U-boat production and movements, providing warning when new boats were entering service and directing forces to intercept them. The goal was to make the Atlantic too dangerous for submarines to operate effectively, even if complete elimination of the threat was no longer possible. The Schnorkel-equipped U-boats that operated in the final year of the war achieved less than German planners had hoped, but more than Allied commanders found comfortable. Losses among convoys increased slightly compared to the low point of late 1943, though they remained far below the catastrophic levels of 1942. More troubling was the return of psychological pressure on merchant sailors and naval crews who had believed the worst was over. The knowledge that submarines were again operating in waters thought to be cleared created stress that affected morale throughout the convoy system. The experience of Allied escorts hunting schnorkeling submarines was frustrating in ways that the earlier campaign had not been. Detection was possible, but inconsistent. ASDIC contacts that would previously have been pursued with confidence now had to be evaluated more cautiously. Was the submarine truly detected, or was the operator interpreting noise as signal? Attacks that seemed to hit their targets often produced no confirmation of destruction. Submarines that should have been damaged or sunk reappeared on later patrols, their schnorkels allowing them to survive damage that would have been fatal to their predecessors. The certainty that had characterized the triumphant months of 1943 gave way to a grinding uncertainty that wore on crews and commanders alike. The Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare establishment worked continuously on improvements to detection and attack systems. Better ASDIC sets with improved resolution and range entered service. Ahead-throwing weapons like squid allowed escorts to attack submarines without losing ASDIC contact during the approach. Improved depth charges with more reliable fusing and greater explosive power increased the probability that a detected submarine would be destroyed. Each improvement offered marginal gains, but the Schnorkel's basic advantage, a minimal target that was simply hard to find, remained unaddressed. The war ended before the full implications of the Schnorkel and the Type 21 could be realized. Germany surrendered in May 1945 with most of its advanced submarines either incomplete, sunk during construction by Allied bombing, or only recently operational, without trained crews to man them. The few Type 21s that did conduct war patrols demonstrated remarkable capabilities. One boat covered 1,000 miles in a single submerged transit, but there were too few of them, deployed too late to affect the war's outcome. The potential that Allied planners had feared remained potential only, unrealized in the conflict that produced it. The legacy of the Schnorkel and the technologies it enabled would be realized in the post-war period. The American, British, and Soviet navies all captured German submarines and studied their designs intensively. The Type 21 became the template for a new generation of submarine development. Its principles of streamlined hulls and extended underwater capability adopted by all major navies. The Schnorkel became standard equipment, refined and improved until modern submarines could operate for weeks without surfacing. The revolution that Germany had begun in desperation was completed by its conquerors in the decades that followed. For ASDIC and its descendants, the Schnorkel represented a challenge that would never fully be resolved. The fundamental problem, that a small target is harder to detect than a large one, could be ameliorated but not eliminated. Subsequent generations of sonar would offer improved sensitivity and resolution, but submarines would continue to evolve in ways that minimized their acoustic signatures. The invisible arms race that began in the Atlantic in 1944 continues to this day, with each improvement in detection technology matched by improvements in submarine stealth. The Schnorkel was the first move in a game that has never ended. The men who fought this phase of the battle on both sides experienced war at its most abstract and impersonal. There were no dramatic surface engagements, no visible enemies, no moments of human contact between opposing forces. The battle was fought through instruments and calculations, through the interpretation of data and the probability of detection. Submarine crews strained to hear the ping of ASDIC through their hulls, adjusting course and depth to evade, never seeing the ships that hunted them. Escort crews studied screens and listened to headphones, prosecuting attacks against enemies they would never observe directly. The technology mediated everything, transforming combat into something closer to a lethal game of hide-and-seek played in 3 dimensions in absolute darkness. The invisible war beneath the waves was decided ultimately by factors that transcended technology. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce Type 21s in numbers that could have changed the strategic balance. The Allied bombing campaign that devastated German factories and transportation networks constrained submarine production as severely as any technological countermeasure. The oil that U-boats needed for their diesels was itself a casualty of the blockade that American submarines were conducting in the Pacific. Germany was strangling for the same resources it had tried to deny Britain, its advanced technologies rendered irrelevant by the collapse of the industrial base needed to deploy them. Yet the technological developments of 1944 and 45 pointed toward a future in which submarines would be even more dangerous, even harder to detect, even more central to naval strategy. The Schnorkel had bought time for the U-boat force, had demonstrated that submarines could adapt to detection technologies that seemed to have rendered them obsolete. The Type 21 had shown what a submarine designed for underwater operations could achieve. Together, they established principles that would guide submarine development for the next half-century, principles that would make the nuclear-powered submarines of the Cold War possible, and would keep the invisible arms race going through generations of increasingly sophisticated technology. The battle between ASDIC and Schnorkel was never conclusively resolved. Like most technological competitions, it ended in a draw that simply set the stage for the next round of innovation. The British could detect schnorkeling submarines often enough to constrain their operations, but not reliably enough to eliminate the threat. The Germans could evade detection often enough to survive, but not consistently enough to restore the offensive capability they had possessed in 1942. Both sides were fighting the last battles of a war that was already decided on land, their efforts affecting the margin of victory, but not its fundamental direction. What remains is the memory of an arms race conducted in secrecy and darkness, where victory was measured in probabilities rather than territory, where the weapons were instruments and the casualties were statistics. The men who served on both sides understood that they were fighting a kind of war that previous generations could not have imagined, a war of technology and technique that demanded skills their fathers had never needed. They adapted, improvised, and survived, or didn't, in a contest where the rules changed constantly, and the only certainty was that the enemy was always working on something new. The Schnorkel versus ASDIC was one chapter in that contest. The contest itself continues.